Those look good. A big salty clam would sure go great with this heat.
Hello and welcome to the newly rebranded Trump Card Reviews, formerly Thomas Paine. I changed it on the advice of some subscribers, and don't say I never listened to you. So, welcome to the new me. Much the same as the old me, or have I evolved like a humble squirtle into a resplendent war turtle? Today I'm going to be having a look at the HBO series Perry Mason, because season 2 is coming out in a few weeks on March the 6th, and I'm thinking of doing a full review on it. So how was season 1 of Perry Mason 2020? Well, I have very mixed feelings. It's well acted and written, and I still wouldn't recommend the show, because do you know what 2020 Perry Mason is? Not Perry Mason. They've changed almost everything. John Lithgow is great in it. It's one of the best performances I've ever seen from him. This Perry Mason has a lot of talent behind it. It has Robert Downey Jr. as an executive producer. Many of the episodes are directed by Timothy Van Patten, who worked on The Wire, Rome, Deadwood, The Sopranos, and a lot more. The show has a lot of talented actors on board, and it also has Tatiana Maslany. Okay, that was a cheap shot, and that was not fair of me, but in my defence, I found it funny. And frankly, she knows what she did, and no, I still haven't forgiven Tatiana for She-Hulk, and I'm not sure what it would take at this point. Maybe a formal apology, but honestly, she's not even that bad in Perry Mason. So She-Hulk maybe points to bad writing and direction instead of it being her fault. I also had another message from regular commenter Goka in response to my Ant-Man 3 coverage saying, "Can't wait for the Marvel movie or show that makes She-Hulk look like a well-polished gem," and to this I responded, "It sounds like you're waiting for the Marvels. That's coming out on the 28th of July. As someone who read Iron Man at a young age, I fear I'm also not going to like Ironheart very much. I'm anticipating watching that is going to feel much like having salt and vinegar flavoured crisps rubbed into an open wound." Early on in the show, Mason is working as a private investigator for a movie company who want dirt on one of their movie stars who they think is breaking a good behaviour clause in his contract. Mason follows the man until he finds the very obese gentleman eating pumpkin pie off of and out of a woman, which is very uncivilised behaviour and is quite a bad idea. Firstly, because the young lady in question is just asking for a yeast infection, and secondly, because I'm not sure it really goes. It's like pairing trout with a Merlot. I mean, what is this man, a barbarian? Don't get me wrong, I like pie as much as the next man, but this is ridiculous.
Those look good. A big salty clam would sure go great with this heat.
Well, yes, Fred, but just not with a claret. But that does raise a question. If you're going to do that for a lady friend, does that call for a red or a white wine? And what the hell kind of Perry Mason adaptation have I walked into here? I don't remember Raymond Burr and Barbara Hale doing any of this business. I'm pretty sure he was not that way inclined anyway. The show is also depressing as hell, which is why I'm having to make my own fun. It's set in the Great Depression, and if you're going to get upset at subjects like people ending their own lives, deceased babies, N-bombs, racism and sexism, maybe give this show a miss. And why is this even a trope in entertainment? Why are deceased babies now a running theme in multiple shows? What audience were they going for? Everything about the original Perry Mason has been altered in the making of this. Perry Mason in this show is not a lawyer, but instead a PI at the start, and he's nothing like Perry Mason. He's not hard-eyed and in control, he's a mess whose life is falling apart. The actor playing him is quite thin, unlike the Perry Mason of the books, who's built like a linebacker. Raymond Burr was a good casting choice. They also retconned Perry Mason, so he only becomes a lawyer in this series because of the actions of Della Street, so they've also removed his agency, and he gets beaten up in about half of the episodes. They made Perry Mason into a whipping boy in his own show. Also, they made the frankly bizarre choice of making Della Street a lesbian. which is a terrible idea from my perspective because one of the best parts of the original show was the X-Files-like will they won't they of the relationship between Perry Mason and Della Street, and by the end Della Street is going full Brie Larson as she demands that Mason pay for her to be a lawyer too and take her on as a partner.
You're gonna make a great lady lawyer.
I'm gonna make a great lawyer, no modifier.
Is it Tom Cruise over here?
No, I want to be the first me, not the next Tom Cruise. Thank you very much.
They're telling a story here, but the problem is that it isn't the story of Perry Mason. They also made some minor changes to the character of Paul Drake. He is now not a PI, he's instead a cop. And there's also the matter of him now being of a different ethnicity. I like the actor Chris Chalk from the series Gotham, but you could have just given him a different name and a completely different character in this series.
But I, for one, am heartily looking forward to Season 2 of Perry Mason, where I can only presume the role of Ken Malansky will be expertly played by Peter Mensa. The conclusion is hard to avoid again, that Hollywood strongly appears to be taking the piss. So yes, a Hollywood production has made lots of dumb choices to crudely insert representation without much thought as to what it would do to the story. Ergo, it's a day ending in a Y, and it's exactly like The Boys again. Why even call it Perry Mason when you've changed almost everything about it? They could have just written an original story. But it wouldn't have been enough for them to write an original story. They wanted to retcon the entire of Perry Mason, colonise and plant a flag in it with all the gentle tenderness and proselytising zeal of Hernan Cortes arriving in Mexico. This series did not have to be linked to Perry Mason at all. It's closer in themes and tone to LA Noire anyway. But what I did find to be excellent was the first ever Perry Mason book, printed all the way back in 1933, The Case of the Velvet Claws, that I had intended to just read some of for background research, and then found that I'd read the whole thing. I couldn't put it down. I'll put a link up to the review for that, because it turns out original Perry Mason, kind of a badass. Or you can watch this TV version where you instead watch him get stomped by a fat guy in a phone booth. Perry Mason, the HBO one from 2020, and where did I leave off last time? Well, I was talking about how the books are far better than any of the series. I'll put a link below to where you can read the first book as a PDF for free online if you want to do that. It's called The Case of the Velvet Claws, as well as I'll leave a link to my review of it. The 2020 version is also probably the worst TV version to date, worse for me than the TV movies and worse than the series from 1957 that I went back to watch as further background research, and it's the Hollywood curse again. The new version has better actors, far more resources, but it fails to grasp what made Perry Mason good and popular in the first place. The writer of Perry Mason, Earl Stanley Gardner, was also a lawyer, and he writes that into his books. The way he acts is almost like Sherlock Holmes if he was a lawyer. It concentrates on justice, logic and ethics. I've been comparing the 2020 Perry Mason series to Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania as well, the last thing that I reviewed, and I was thinking to myself, what is my favourite character arc from Ant-Man 3? And it's a trick question, because there are no character arcs in Ant-Man 3. I can think of none. No character learns or changes in any way in over 2 hours of film, and that's always a good sign, isn't it? So back to Perry Mason. It's a prequel to the Raymond Burr TV series in which the lawyer Perry Mason would help people falsely arrested for usually murder. He'd then catch the real killer and free the innocent person. It was based on a series of 82 books written by Earl Stanley Gardner from 1933 forward to 1973. This prequel, though, is quite different and writes the years of Perry Mason just after the First World War. He goes back to the US and instead works as a private eye. In the main plot, he is working as a PI for a lawyer played by John Lithgow. The lawyer's assistant, Della Street, is played by Juliet Rylance. The show opens in Los Angeles with a couple whose baby has been kidnapped and ransomed. They've brought the money and are told on the phone to look out of the window of the building they're in at a cable car, where they see the baby. They're told to leave the money and go to the baby and not look back. They frantically run to the cable car and pick up the baby to find out that it's not alive, and its eyes have been sewn open to give the illusion of life. And by the stars, is it too much to ask for something cheerful to watch? Can we please not have dead babies as a writing trope going forward? I got enough of this with House of the Dragon. Perry is also estranged from his wife and child and is living on his deceased parents' farm that he can't pay for and is probably going to lose due to debts. He's also having one of the least appealing romances I've ever seen, and I was almost ready to bail out of this series after episode 1 and the baby, but it gets a little less depressing after the first couple of episodes, but only a little, as the baby's father and then mother are implicated separately in the kidnapping. The show details Perry's investigation in trying to find out the truth and avoid the death penalty for the baby's parents. So I slowly start getting into the series, and then halfway through, a character ends their own life in a very heartbreaking way, and I start to lose the will to live again. The show is set in the interwar 30s, and this is used for a lot of modern day allegory and to bring up themes like racism and sexism, so be forewarned about the baby and the fact that Perry Mason at one point drops an N-bomb when talking to a black police officer, who then kicks his ass. And it's hard to imagine Raymond Burr's Perry Mason doing any of that. Is that what Perry Mason's like in the books? I wasn't sure. I wanted to read them and find out, out of fear that it would disappoint me, and also because in the Perry Mason series of books there are 82 of them. But I did read the first one, published in 1933, and it turns out it's not without casual N-bombs. But this series did not personally work. At the moment, noir is just too dark for me. The change to make Della Street lesbian is also hard to forgive. This is coming right after Velma, and this is long past becoming cliché at this point. This is the third time in the last 3 or 4 things that I've reviewed. We had Velma, Queen Maeve, now Della Street. It is at this point really getting annoying. They could have written a new character into the story who was LGBT. I do not like that this keeps on happening. It's manipulative, and I do not appreciate people trying to manipulate me. It's happening over and over again, and it's getting very boring. Hollywood is like a dog with a bone. Up to now, I can think of no reference to Della Street being a lesbian in any of the 90 years of preceding material. In fact, from the books, it seems like Della was romantically involved with Perry Mason. In fact, from the end of the first book, talking about Perry and Della, his long arms circled her shoulders and scooped her to him, his lips pressed down to hers. So a book series that had themes of justice and logic emanating from 1933 was in the end another bait and switch. Imagine my shock, using an existing IP as a vehicle for current year American political propaganda, which is now transplanted into it race and gender politics. Again, for a change. That only makes this and almost everything else coming from Hollywood for the last 20 years. But never mind any of that. She's a lesbian from here on out. Never mind that time where Perry and Della got married. Never mind that they kissed in the first book. This is how Della Street is described in the third book, The Case of the Lucky Legs. Della Street, his devoted secretary, whose soft heart for the underdog is equalled only by her concern for Perry Mason's safety. She was not in this book and never has been a lawyer.
You're gonna make a great lady lawyer.
I'm gonna make a great lawyer, no modifier.
We got Tom Cruise over here.
No, I want to be the first me, not the next Tom Cruise. Thank you very much.
This is grossly disrespectful to the author's vision of their own story. A man who died in 1970 and isn't here anymore to object or defend his work. This is exactly what was done to Tolkien with the Rings of Power. And by taking Della Street and making her LGBT and making her responsible for Perry Mason becoming a lawyer in the first place, they've handed over the credit
for Perry Mason's fictional good deeds to the LGBT community. This is an attempt to manipulate and indoctrinate viewers. And then they have the gall at the end of Perry Mason 2020 to reference the first book from 1933 by having the character of Eve Griffin come in and ask Perry for help. The first book that was far superior in every way to this series.
Could you make me a cup of tea, please, Stephanie?